All right, everyone, we're back. So right now our morning news site doesn't really look a whole lot like the morning news. And actually, let's drag this tab over here so we can flip between. So we've got the basic, the basic HTML in here, but it doesn't look anything like it. So we need to start adding some CSS. So let's jump back over to our HTML page. So I want to take a few minutes though to just quickly talk about IDs and classes. So if you noticed in the last screencast, I added IDs and classes to some of our tags. And these have two purposes. One, they help us identify parts of our HTML document. They're kind of like labels. And two, they also help us, they also will act as the selectors in CSS. So it is how we'll identify elements we want to style within CSS. So just a rule of thumb, classes can be used multiple times on a page. So I could have this div class container show up as many times on the page as I like. IDs must be unique to each page. So I can only have one banner per page or one main section per page. So that's typically how you use those. I use both. Sometimes I use them both in the same tag. Sometimes I use one or the other. It just all depends on the situation and what I'm trying to do. So that's just a quick overview of the IDs and tags, and I'll show you how we reference those in our CSS document. So the first things first is let's take care of this big banner up top. So in our HTML, you can see that our banner is ID'd as such, banner, ID banner. So in CSS, we reference IDs with the pound sign. So we can type banner, curly brackets, and within our curly brackets is where our CSS is going to go. So I'm going to bring this down a line just to make it a little bit easier to read. But the first thing we notice about this text is that it's centered on the page. So that's a pretty easy style to accomplish using the text align property. We can tell that text to be center. So now if we refresh, you can see that that's there. So even if we wanted to, just kind of copy that out and stick it in there. Remember, you should not be copying web pages for production. This is a learning exercise, so it's okay, but we don't want to make a habit of doing things like this. But now we'll know that that's up there and what it is. So there's a little more style we have to do up here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we know we need to get this to a specific height and background. So I want to figure out what color that is. So I'm going to use my digital color meter on a Mac, and I have my values set to RGB as an 8-bit hex, and I can hover over the color and I can lock it using Command L, and I can see that that's FF312E. So we're going to come back to our CSS and we're going to go background FF, what was it? 312E. We'll save that. We'll go back. Okay, so we're not quite there yet. That's not exactly how I want that to look. Also, our text needs to be white. So let's take care of that and a few other things. So we can make our text white by using the color property, and we can give that a hex value of white. And we should also give it a little bit of padding. Actually, we don't want to give that the padding. Yeah, let's give this the padding. And we'll give that 10 pixels of padding, and we'll save that, see how that looks. Okay, so we're getting close. 10 pixels of padding was probably a little too much. Let's go 6. That's even still too much. Let's go 4. Yeah, man, we don't even need that much. 2. Okay, that'll work. Okay, so one thing you'll notice is this margin around the entire outside of the document. And if we use our selector, or excuse me, our web inspector, we can look at what that is. And if you hover over the body element, you'll notice that the user agent style sheet is applying an 8-pixel margin to our body. So this is Chrome adding a default style to our page. So we want to get rid of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a body selector up top here, and we're just going to say margin 0. So we're going to zero out that margin. And now when we refresh, the page should lock up to the top. So that's pretty close. We're gonna stick with that. So you also notice that the fonts aren't quite the same yet, but we're gonna come back and deal with fonts later. I don't want to worry about that right now. It's really, really easy to get sucked into those little details. Like we could go in here and bold all these and make all these links and all this italic, make all this text italic, but we don't want to fuss with that yet because it's not that important. We can come back and do the details later. So we have our little header in there, and that's looking pretty good. The next thing we need to do is we need to get our main content centered on the page. If you look at the morning news, their content does not go all the way out to the edges. There's this nice, consistent, even margin on each side, which kind of squishes the site into the center of the page. So this is why we used our container element. You can see it down here, but also you can see it in our HTML right here, excuse me. And this is what's going to kind of hold everything in. So what we want to do is we want to set a width on this container so that it is not so that our content will not stretch any larger than that particular area. So we're going to create a new selector down here. We're going to call it a container. Now you'll notice because that's a class, I'm using dot container instead of # container. So we want to use the width property. And let's just start with 900 pixels and see what that does. So we'll switch back to our browser. And now you can see that it's cut it off here. And I bet it's going to be a little narrower than that, but let's stick with 900 pixels for right now and see where that gets us. So the problem is right now our site is kind of shifted over to the left. And what we want is it to be in the middle of the page, almost center justified if you're thinking in like Microsoft Word terms. But the problem is if we just centered this text, the edges would be ragged. So if we just went container, text, align, center, we're not going to really get what we're looking for. In fact, what you'd want to do is get rid of that width. And there we go. So now our text is centered, but our widths are off, but it just looks horrible to have center justified text like that. So let's undo that. And we're going to use a trick called the margin 0 auto trick. And that's not even really a good name for it, but this is just standard centering in CSS. It's the easiest centering, it always works, and it's the one I use every single time. You set the basic width of your container, and then you apply a margin 0 auto. And what this is actually doing is saying the top and bottom margin needs to be 0, and the left and right margin needs to be auto. Another way to write this would be margin 0 auto 0 auto, because the margin property takes 4 parameters: the top, left, bottom, and right padding in pixels. So we can shorten that to margin 0 auto. And what this will do is when you save that and go back over to your site, you'll now see that the site is contained, it's centered properly in the page, but it's also right justified, so it's not ragged on both edges. So if we'll look at the morning news, you can see the morning news is a little skinnier than that. So let's take this down to like 800 and see what that does. Yeah, maybe it's more like 850. I'd say between 850 and 900 should be fine. So now we're starting to kind of see things coming together. This is starting to look a little bit more like the morning news, and we have our basic content and structure in place. So in the next screencast, we're going to move on down the line and take care of our content and sidebar areas.